Have you ever felt like something about you is different, but you couldn't quite explain why? Like everyone else seemed to understand things you didn't, or things that felt easy for them felt overwhelming for you. I felt that way for years, and for a long time, I didn't have the words for it. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. And more importantly, different doesn't mean broken. But that's not how neurodivergence is usually talked about. Most of the time, it's framed like something to fix instead of a different way of thinking, feeling, and experiencing the world. And that's exactly what this podcast is here to change. Welcome to the first episode of Minds That Think Differently. I am your host, Amanda. For accessibility, I'll give a brief visual description of myself. I am a 16-year-old girl. I am white with brown shoulder-length hair and brown eyes, and today I am wearing a white sweater. I am speaking into a Blue Yeti microphone, and I am recording from my bedroom. Behind me is my bookshelf and wall of paintings and art I've made. I was diagnosed autistic at the age of 10, and now at 16, I'm starting this podcast to educate, reduce stigma, and empower neurodivergent people. A lot of ableism comes from a lack of understanding. Neurodivergence isn't something most people are taught about, but it should be something they're taught about. So this podcast will explore topics that aren't widely discussed and uplift neurodivergent voices by sharing real experiences. In this first episode, we're going to start with the basics, what neurodivergence actually means and the language around it. Before we get into that, I want to talk about something really important to me, accessibility. My episodes will have full transcripts and captioning created by me and not auto-generated, so they're accurate and intentional. Transcripts will be screen reader friendly, and I will include phonetic spellings and pronunciations for more complex terms so everyone can follow along. You can also expect clear transitions, content warnings when needed, content recaps at the end of each episode, and timestamps for each segment. Accessibility is very important to me as a podcast about neurodiversity, so if you have any ideas to make this podcast even more accessible, I would love to hear them. Accessibility isn't an extra feature of this podcast. It's a core value. All sources and further reading will be linked in the show notes. For all questions, comments, concerns, or business inquiries, please email me at connect@thinkdifferentpod.com. I want to say something important. If you're completely new to this topic, if you're coming into this episode with no idea what neurodivergence is, that's okay. You don't need to understand or memorize everything in this episode, and I will try and make this episode as beginner-friendly as possible. This is just an introduction. We're building a foundation, and we'll go deeper into all of these topics in future episodes. Content warning. This episode contains a brief educational discussion regarding the history of the R slur and its removal from medical literature. No slurs are spoken aloud in this recording. Alright, before we dive into terminology, I want to start with something I'll be including in every episode, the mailbox segment. This is where I'll answer listener questions and share stories. Since these first episodes are pre-recorded, I'll be answering a common question instead. Today's question is, how do I know if I'm neurodivergent? The short answer is, it's not always simple. There isn't one test, one checklist, or one moment where everything suddenly clicks. For a lot of people, it's a gradual process of learning, reflecting, and starting to recognize patterns in how your brain works compared to what you've been told is typical. You might start to notice things like feeling different socially. For me, one of the earliest signs was struggling with friendships. I remember trying really hard to make friends, but I was somehow always doing it wrong, while everyone else seemed to form these friend groups and I just ended up on my own. Another thing would be struggling with sensory environments or finding certain tasks much harder or easier than the people around you. You might relate really strongly to other neurodivergent people's experiences and feel like, wait, that sounds like me. For some people, that leads to a professional diagnosis, but it's also important to recognize that diagnosis isn't accessible to everyone. It can be expensive, time-consuming, and affected by bias, especially for girls, people of color, and those who mask well. Because of that, a lot of people begin with self-identification. That might look like researching, listening to lived experiences, and slowly building an understanding of yourself over time. And I want to be really clear about something. Wondering if you're neurodivergent doesn't come from nowhere. People don't usually ask that question unless something already feels different. At the same time, it's okay not to have a definitive answer right away. You don't need to label yourself immediately to start learning about your brain, your needs, and what supports will help you. This episode is going to give you the language to start exploring that question. So whether you're neurodivergent, questioning, or just here to learn, you're in the right place. So let's get into it. Alright, now that we've talked about that, let's build a foundation. Because before we go deeper into these topics, we need to understand the language. So first, what actually is neurodiversity? Let's simplify this in case you're completely new to the topic. Neurodiversity just means that not everyone's brain works in the same way. Neurodiversity is the idea that people experience and interact with the world in many different ways. There isn't one right way to think, learn, or behave. Different doesn't mean wrong, it just means different. And neurodivergent describes people whose brains work differently from what's considered typical. That means they might have different strengths and different challenges. Neurodivergence isn't just one thing, it's an umbrella. It includes things like autism, ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyspraxia, synesthesia, Down syndrome, and more. The first time I ever ran into neurodivergence was online. When I was diagnosed, I knew I was autistic, but I wasn't really sure what that meant. I researched a lot online, and that really helped me understand some of these things a lot better. As well as joining online autistic communities helped me connect and find people because I didn't know anyone in my life who was openly autistic or neurodivergent at all at that time. So, quick recap. Neurodiversity is the big idea that all brains are different. Neurodivergent describes a person, and neurodivergence is the experience. Another set of words you will hear all the time is neurotypical and neurotype. Neurotypical just means someone who isn't neurodivergent. Some communities have certain forms of this, such as the autistic community, which uses the word allistic for anyone who is not autistic. A neurotype refers to each person's unique brain. Neurotypes are part of your identity, not just conditions. There is no one neurotype that is better than another. It's just another way to describe how someone experiences the world. An example of a neurotype would be autism, ADHD, synesthesia, etc. It's just another way to describe a neurodivergent person. For example, my neurotype is autism. For me, that means my brain functions differently to a neurotypical brain and to brains of other neurotypes. A big conversation in the neurodivergent community is person-first versus identity-first language. Person-first language puts the person before the condition. For example, person with autism, or person with ADHD, or person with a disability. The goal is to emphasize the individual, not the diagnosis. Identity-first language does the opposite. It places the identity first, like autistic person, ADHDer, disabled person, or dyslexic person. It places identity first and recognizes that it's an important part of who someone is. Think about it like this. You could say, I am a person who loves reading, or you could say, I am a reader. Both are correct, but one treats it as separate, and the other treats it as part of your identity. Person-first language is often used in medical contexts, while identity-first language is often preferred by the neurodivergent community. Identity-first language shows that the condition is not negative, and it is something the person embraces. If someone said person with creativity versus creative person, those feel slightly different. One sounds like it's something separate from you, and the other sounds like it's part of who you are. That's how a lot of people feel about identity-first language. It reflects that it isn't something separate from them, it's part of their identity. The most important part of person-first versus identity-first language is to ask. Some neurodivergent people don't care and use both interchangeably, and some have a preference. So whenever you are in doubt, just ask the person what they prefer. I prefer identity first because it feels like who I am. I can say, my name is Amanda and I am autistic. Now let's talk about the medical and social models of disability. The medical model of disability views disability as something wrong with the individual that needs to be treated or fixed. It focuses on what is wrong with the person. The social model of disability shifts that perspective. It says disability isn't just about the person. It's about the environment that they're in. For example, if someone can't walk and there are only stairs, the medical model says the problem is their legs. The social model says the problem is the stairs. The same applies to neurodivergence. If I can't focus in the classroom because of buzzing fluorescent lights, the medical model says I'm the problem. The social model would say the environment, in this case the lights, need to change. And that shift from what's wrong with you to what support do you need is huge, because a lot of the time the problem isn't the person, it's the barriers around them. This relates to terminology and language use because a lot of the words that the neurodivergent and disabled community uses come from the social model of disability and not the medical model of disability. The medical model of disability has been used to justify segregation, institutionalization, and frame disability as tragic and disabled people as lesser than. This relates to the discussion because the diagnoses that people are given to be characterized as part of the neurodivergent community are often called disorders or diseases, but many prefer condition over disorder or disease and use difference rather than deficit. Neurodiversity is not a disease, nor is it something to cure. We do not need to focus on finding cures for conditions. We need to focus on making the world a more accessible place for all disabled people alike. The social model of disability encompasses the neurodiversity movement. The neurodiversity movement was coined by Judy Singer in the 1990s, and it challenges discrimination and pushes for socio-political change, and acknowledges systemic barriers and societal structures often create challenges. This podcast is committed to the social model, but language is always evolving and changing. If I ever miss something or use a term that feels outdated to you, please reach out. I'm still learning and growing as well. Now, let's talk about masking. Masking is when someone hides or suppresses their neurodivergent traits to fit in. This can look like copying how others act, forcing yourself to sit still, and pretending to understand things when you don't. Masking is essentially hiding who you are to fit in. For me, my masking looked like copying others' interests to try and fit in. If my friend liked this movie, I would like it too. This actually led to me feeling like I was a different person for every person I was around, which is something I'll talk more about in my masking episode, but masking was really harmful for me personally. Masking is something I did for a long time without realizing it. I would go home from school, feel drained, have meltdowns and shutdowns almost every day, and I was so drained even though I was only in elementary school. At the time, I didn't understand why, but now I realize this was burnout from masking all day. So why do neurodivergent people mask? Often it's to fit in or avoid judgment, exclusion, or even harm. But masking comes at a cost. Over time, it can lead to burnout, anxiety, and even a loss of identity. You may hear some neurodivergent people talk about unmasking, which is the process of stopping masking. This can be a lifelong journey, and it is a journey of personal acceptance, the understanding that we don't need to mask to fit in and we are perfect as we are. I began my unmasking journey and have unmasked around my friends and immediate family, but I find that I do still mask during school and around my extended family. Unmasking is a hard journey, and it is one that I'm still on, and I'm still learning and working on unmasking. So what is stimming? Stimming is something everyone does, and it's just repetitive movements or actions that help regulate emotions or focus. Examples include hand flapping, rocking back and forth, pacing, hair twirling, nail biting, jumping up and down, and many more. There are many stims that are very common that we don't even recognize as stims in society. For example, cracking knuckles or muscles in general, clicking a pen or spinning a pen, clearing your throat, humming, tensing and relaxing muscles, and many more. For me, one of my earliest stims was biting my nails. I didn't even realize it was a stim at the time. It was just something I did when I was anxious or needed something for my hands to do. I also used to rock back and forth when I was bored or waiting in lines, and I didn't think much of it until I learned what stimming actually was. We stim for a lot of different reasons: self-regulation, emotional processing, sensory input, or even just focus. And it's important to remember stimming isn't something that needs to be stopped or fixed. It's a natural way our brains and bodies interact with the world. Now, let's talk about communication. Neurodivergent people often communicate differently, and different doesn't mean wrong. For example, info dumping, which is basically talking a lot about something you're passionate about. I do this with my special interest, language and linguistics. I can talk about it for a long time. Another difference is with literal thinking and sarcasm. Literal thinking is taking things exactly as they're said. I'm a very literal thinker. There have been so many times where someone said something sarcastic, everyone else laughed, and I just sat there confused, because I took what they said at face value. And it made me feel like I was missing something everyone else understood instantly. That doesn't mean something is wrong. It just means that my brain processes communication differently. Often, neurodivergent people are very blunt, and such as myself will be very honest with their opinions. Blunt communication just means being very direct. Oftentimes, neurodivergent people will have different communication styles than you are used to, but different doesn't mean wrong. For example, I'm a very literal thinker. I sometimes struggle with jokes, sarcasm, or irony, so I tend to communicate more directly. That might look different from what most people are used to, but it's just another valid way of communicating. Echolalia is a type of stimming where someone repeats words or phrases they've heard. This also appears in Tourette syndrome as a type of tic. An example of this would be repeating words or phrases from TV shows or movies, or repeating things other people say. Some neurodivergent people are non-speaking and may communicate using an AAC, augmentation and alternative communication device, sign language, writing, gestures, or another method. I will have a whole episode on non-speaking communication. For example, someone might use an AAC device to type out what they want to say, or use gestures or writing instead of speaking. That doesn't mean they have nothing to say. It just means they communicate differently. Some neurodivergent people can be speaking at some times and non-speaking at other times, such as during sensory overloads or shutdowns. There is nothing wrong with being non-speaking, however, it is highly stigmatized. When you communicate with neurodivergent people, it will be a unique experience every time. Another big takeaway from this episode is not all neurodivergent people are the same. Everyone will communicate differently and have different preferences, so when in doubt, just ask. Before we move on to the next section, I'm going to include a short sensory break. This is something I'll include in every episode, usually about 30 to 90 seconds to give you a moment to pause and rest. If you're able to, close your eyes. Bring attention to your body. Notice how the ground feels beneath you. Notice your breathing. Notice small sensations like your hair, your hands, or the air around you. There's nothing you need to do. Just exist in this moment. Now I'm going to briefly introduce some neurodivergent identities. This won't be in depth. We'll cover these in future episodes, but this will give you a general idea of what falls under neurodivergence and will help build a framework and basic understanding of each. If it feels like a lot right now, that's completely okay. You're not expected to memorize all this. Autism is a spectrum, meaning every autistic person you meet will be different. Many autistic people have social and sensory difficulties, as well as communication differences, and many mask their traits. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition and it is lifelong. For me, I struggle a lot with the social and sensory aspects. I struggle with communicating with others, and I have a lot of sensory difficulties. For example, I really struggle in environments where a lot of people are having many conversations, like cafeterias, theaters, or gyms, but that's just one example of a difficulty. People with ADHD often struggle with focus and attention, and many are impulsive. But ADHD is not about laziness. It's about executive functioning differences in the brain, which are planning, organizing, and completing tasks. Just being forgetful does not mean you have ADHD. A simple example is trying to start homework. You might sit down fully intending to do it, but your brain just won't start. or you get distracted halfway through and you're doing something completely different without even realizing how you got there. Dyslexia is a neurodevelopmental learning disorder that makes reading, spelling, and processing language difficult. Dyslexic people are not less intelligent, they just process language differently. For example, you might read the same sentence over and over and it just doesn't stick. Or the letters might seem jumbled or out of order, even though you understand the topic when it's explained out loud. Dyspraxia affects fine and gross motor skills such as balance and movement. Dyspraxia can also affect your memory, organizational skills, and sometimes sensory processing and speech. This could look like struggling to tie your shoes, bumping into things more often, or having a harder time with coordination in sports even if you understand what you're supposed to do. Dysgraphia is a learning disability that affects writing skills. It can make handwriting messy, slow, or hard to organize. People with dysgraphia can also struggle with spelling or putting their thoughts into words, but it does not reflect their intelligence. For example, you might have a clear idea in your head, but when you try and write it out, it comes out messy, disorganized, or incomplete, which could be really frustrating. Dyscalculia is a learning disability that makes it hard to understand, learn, and perform tasks with math and numbers. Many people can go into adulthood without knowing they have this. This might look like looking at a clock and knowing you should understand it, but the numbers just don't connect. Mixing up numbers or even finding basic math really confusing even with practice. I'm going to pause here for a second because that was a lot. If you're starting to feel overwhelmed, that's completely okay. You're not expected to remember all this. This is just to give you a general idea, and we'll go deeper into each of these later. Tourette's is a neurological disorder involving involuntary, repetitive movements and vocalizations known as tics. Tics can be motor or vocal, and they cannot be controlled but can be temporarily suppressed. Although suppressing tics can be painful, debilitating, and sometimes lead to tic attacks. For example, someone might have a motor tic like blinking or head jerking, or a vocal tic, and even if they try to stop it, it can build up until it has to come out. Sensory processing disorder is when the brain has difficulty receiving, organizing, and responding to sensory information. This can lead people to either be hypersensitive, hyposensitive, or a mix of both. This could look like certain sounds feeling physically painful, or the opposite, needing really strong input like loud music or movement just to feel regulated. Synesthesia is when multiple neurons in the brain fire at once, causing multiple senses such as tasting colors or seeing music. There will be a full episode explaining this. For example, someone might see colors when they hear music or associate certain numbers or letters with certain colors automatically. It's not something they imagine, it just happens. OCD involves intrusive thoughts, which are the obsessions that create anxiety. People try to relieve these intrusive thoughts through repetitive behaviors, which are called compulsions. They feel driven to perform these behaviors to ease stress. There is a debate whether OCD is a neurotype or a mental health condition, but I just decided to include it here since this is my intro and foundational episode. For example, someone might have intrusive thoughts, like something bad will happen if I don't do this, and then feel like they have to repeat an action, like checking or counting, to relieve that anxiety. Hyperlexia is often common in autistic people, when someone has early, highly advanced reading skills, and often an obsessive focus on letters or books with low comprehension of the material read, and can also have communication difficulties. For example, someone might be able to read at a very advanced level at a young age, but still struggle to understand or explain what they read. RSD, or rejection sensitive dysphoria, is an extreme, overwhelming emotional response to being rejected. It is a perceived reaction, meaning you might just think they rejected you, even if they didn't. It is often associated with ADHD and autism. It is not an official diagnosis in the DSM-5, rather an experience often understood by neurodivergent people. This might look like someone feeling deeply hurt or rejected over something small, like a short text response or a change in tone, even if the other person didn't mean anything by it. Okay, that's all of them. I hope that wasn't too much information. Many of these conditions I talked about can be co-occurring, meaning people can have multiple, and it's actually quite common, such as autism and ADHD are commonly co-occurring, as well as anxiety and RSD, or SPD and synesthesia. Co-occurring conditions influence how someone experiences the world and what supports they might need. There are also mood disorders and mental health disorders that are under this umbrella, but I will cover that in my mental health episode. A few things to remember about these conditions is that they are lifelong and neurological, meaning they are in the brain. There's nothing wrong or negative about a person for having any of these conditions. It's just how their brain is. Next, I want to talk about why terminology matters and why it is important to respect and understand the language we use when talking about neurodiversity. If you're still here, you're already doing more than most people ever do, learning about how brains actually work. Language shapes how we think. For example, describing something as ancient creates a very different image than calling it vintage. The same applies to how we talk about neurodivergence. When we frame it as a disorder or problem, it often carries negative assumptions. But language can also be used to create understanding, respect, and inclusion. For me personally, I do think I had some internalized ableism when I was first diagnosed, just because I did think of autism as a bad thing and something scary. Now I think back on that and it makes me realize that we need more education on neurodiversity and language. We need more awareness and acceptance around neurodivergence, because if people don't understand it, they won't be understanding or offer support. Using phrases like suffering from autism or struggling with ADHD implies constant hardship. It overlooks strengths and unique perspectives neurodivergent individuals bring to the table. Neurodivergent people experience a wide range of emotions and experiences, and neurodivergent joy should also be centered, and that is something this podcast will try to center. Language evolves over time. A lot of terms that were once used to describe neurodivergent individuals are outdated or harmful, such as the term Asperger's syndrome, which is associated with Hans Asperger, who was part of the Nazi regime and sent children with disabilities to be euthanized, which is why most of the autistic community uses autism instead. Another example of this is the term ADD, which was used to describe individuals who were inattentive but not hyperactive, but this resulted in misunderstandings and led to girls and women being overlooked. So the DSM-5 merged this term under ADHD, and it is now ADHD inattentive type. In this next section, I will briefly discuss a harmful slur for educational purposes so we can understand why it's no longer used. I will not be saying the actual word, but if you'd like to skip this, please jump forward to the next timestamp. The R slur is something I will talk about on this podcast for educational purposes. In the past, it was actually part of the DSM, and it used to be widely used to describe those with intellectual disabilities. However, it became stigmatized and demeaning and was taken out of the DSM-5, and this is a word you should never use. The R slur is a good example of why the medical model can be harmful. When we label a person based on what is wrong with them, society often turns that label into an insult. This is called the euphemism treadmill, where a medical label becomes a slur because of underlying ableism. Using this word ignores the humanity of disabled people and leans into a history of tragedy and less than thinking. Handicapped is also a word that isn't really used anymore, since it focuses more on what individuals can't do rather than what they can do. It reinforces the idea that disabled people are less capable, and now the better word to use is disabled or disabled person. Functioning labels are also outdated, for example, in the context of autism. When I say autism is a spectrum, I do not mean it's a straight line from autistic to not autistic. In fact, none of the spectrums I will talk about in this podcast are straight lines. People can fall anywhere and can move throughout the spectrum. Instead of thinking of it as a little or a lot, think of spectrum as a color wheel or soundboard with different sliders for things like sensory needs, communication, and motor skills. Support needs aren't static. They can change based on the day, our environment, or how much energy we have. A person isn't high or low functioning. They are a human being who needs different levels of support at different times. For example, someone might seem high functioning because they do well in school, but they might struggle a lot with things like social interaction, sensory overload, or daily tasks. So that label doesn't tell you what support they actually need. Therefore, a better term is support needs. Low, medium, or high support needs is the terminology you should use instead of functioning labels. Functioning labels do not clearly reflect someone's needs. Someone can appear quote-unquote high functioning because they are high masking, but they may require more support with other things. Therefore, support needs better reflect the type of support someone needs. I want to acknowledge that mistakes happen. If you use the wrong term, acknowledge it and move forward. Don't dwell on guilt. What matters is that you learn and try to do better next time. That effort is what really makes a difference. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention: neurodivergent joy. So often, conversations focus on struggles, but joy is just as important. For neurodivergent people, joy can be amplified. It can feel bigger, more intense, and can be a source of energy, passion, and a way to connect with others who share your passions. By celebrating neurodivergent joy, we can challenge the stereotypes that focus only on neurodivergent struggle. Joy is just as important as the challenges, and it deserves to be recognized and embraced. What are some examples of neurodivergent joy? It could be flapping hands, spinning in circles, talking about a new hobby, jumping up and down, but joy presents differently in everyone. So everyone will show joy differently, but all forms of joy are valid. For me, one of the biggest sources of joy is sharing my special interests. I can get really excited talking about something I love, and when I find someone who actually wants to listen or shares that interest, it feels amazing. A lot of my joy also comes from my friendships. I put a lot more weight in friendships than most people do, but that means I have loyalty and invest a lot of time into friendships. So how can we support and celebrate neurodivergent joy? Allowing authentic expression. Joy can look different for neurodivergent people. It could be hand flapping, jumping, talking fast, or dancing. These are valid ways to feel happiness. Create safe spaces where big feelings are welcome. Celebrate passions. Encourage hobbies and interests without shame. Share stories. Positive experiences can inspire others and build community. Sometimes joy can be overwhelming. When that happens, it is important to pause and breathe, use comfort tools, create a calming space, plan recovery time, and validate the feeling. There is no wrong way to show joy or happiness, and neurodivergent joy is beautiful. Before we wrap up, I want to share a few resources to those who want to learn more or connect with neurodivergent communities. Depending on where you live, there may be community events near you, so keep an eye out for those. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, is a very good organization to support. Their motto is "Nothing about us without us," meaning disabled people should be at the heart of every conversation, policy, and decision that affects our lives. They advocate for autistic rights, acceptance, and systemic change. Their motto is the guiding principle for this podcast. I've chosen all of these resources because they prioritize neurodivergent voices and leadership and remind us we are the own experts on our lives. The Child Mind Institute focuses on research, advocacy, and public education to improve the lives of children and adolescents with neurodevelopmental conditions. The United Brain Association supports individuals with Tourette syndrome and neurodevelopmental conditions through advocacy, education, and community. National Down Syndrome Society advocates for rights and inclusion of people with Down syndrome. Next Steps Neurodiversity offers a resource guide with advocacy, education, employment, and community supports for autistic, ADHD, and ADHD individuals. The Disability Visibility Project amplifies disability media, culture, and community. Before I end each episode, I will do a 1 to 2 minute recap of everything covered, especially if it was a content-heavy episode. So, neurodiversity is the idea that all brains work differently. Neurodivergent describes individuals whose brains function differently from what's considered typical. We talked about person-first and identity-first language and why asking someone's preference matters most. We explored the medical and social models of disability and how shifting our perspective can change how we support people. We covered masking and why it can lead to burnout, and stimming as natural and helpful behavior. We also introduced different neurodivergent identities and talked about how language evolves and why terminology matters. And finally, we talked about something just as important as challenges: neurodivergent joy. Now I will end with some final thoughts and lasting reminders. Neurodivergence is a hidden disability, but hidden doesn't mean less real. Disabled is also not a bad word because disability is neutral. There's nothing wrong with being neurodivergent. It's not a disease, and it's not something that needs to be cured. Neurodivergent people can live full, successful lives and experience joy, passion, and connection just like everyone else. When you are ever in doubt, ask the neurodivergent person themselves what their preferences are. Don't ask somebody else. Ask them, and stay open to learning. Different isn't broken, and you are never meant to fit a mold. Neurodivergent people may act or communicate differently than you are used to, but there doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that. By understanding terminology, we can help reduce stigma and support inclusion. This episode was just an introduction. All topics I've discussed will have later episodes going more in depth, and the conversation does not end here. I have so many more episodes and topics planned, and I hope you decide to stick around. If you've ever felt different or like you didn't quite fit in, I hope this episode helps you feel a little more understood. You're not broken. Your brain just works differently, and that difference matters. And if you want to continue learning more about your brain and neurodivergence, stick around. I want this podcast to eventually be not just an educational space, but also a community. So I will be ending each episode with one positive affirmation relating to the topic and also a question to reflect on. You can answer the question in the comments, or you can email me your answer, and I may read out some listeners' answers in future episodes. Today's affirmation is: my worth is not determined by societal expectations or my productivity. And the question for this episode is: when you hear the word neurodivergent, what did you think of before listening to this episode, and how has that changed? That is all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have questions, feedback, or episode ideas, please email connect@thinkdifferentpod.com. For my sources and further reading, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening to my first episode, and I'll see you next time on Minds That Think Differently.